Hello everybody, my name is Stefan Kirchner and this is a pre-recording of the lecture The Arctic Our Home, which will be held on the 8th of September 2020 as part of the Arctic Studies program at the University of Lapland. I'm pre-recording this for a number of reasons. The actual lecture on the 8th of September will be held through an online system, and right now, of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced a lot of restrictions with regard to the number of people who meet in a classroom, for example, and so on. Hence the focus also on the online distribution of the lectures. During the lectures, I want to have quite a bit of a debate, and I want to be able to share all of this information, make it available to you, regardless of the technical difficulties that might come up. We're going to use the system which I, for example, haven't used before, which many of you won't have used before. And of course, there can always be technical difficulties. Hence, the idea to pre-record it before the actual event once before the actual event, just to be able to make sure that everybody who wants to access this is able to. I'm recording this right now in video, which will be put on my YouTube channel, as well as an audio version for my podcast, the Arctic Podcast, which you'll find at arcticpodcast.eu, for example. This will all be made available totally free of charge, of course, as all the other materials here in the university's courses. I'll also put links to both files, so the audio file and the video file, in the Moodle for everyone to access. Another reason to pre-record this is, of course, that I'm going to need your consent to record lectures. So if any of you who is going to attend the actual lecture on the 8th or one of my other lectures on the 17th, 18th and 19th of November of 2020, if any of the students are not comfortable with being recorded, we don't have any data protection issues, of course, now with this pre-recorded session. And I just noticed, for those of you who are going to aim for the audio version instead of the YouTube version, the audio started recording a little bit earlier, so don't be surprised that one file is going to be a bit longer than the other. This lecture on the 8th of September 2020 is part of the introductory lectures. The first week of the Arctic Studies program, you're going to be exposed to a number of new ideas, new concepts, and if I see it right, this is scheduled to be for Tuesday afternoon, so that would make it only the second lecture in the whole series. Now, this course my lectures as part of the Arctic Studies program, they're based on the idea that we learn from each other, that there's a process of mutual learning. I'm a lawyer, but I'm aware, of course, that many of you will come from very different backgrounds. The lectures are organized through the social sciences faculty. So a lot of you might be social scientists, but I expect you to have a range of academic backgrounds and interests. I want to learn, of course, also from your perspectives on the Arctic. And I want to learn why you're actually attending this course, what makes the Arctic interesting for you, for example. I hope that you're going to be able to participate actively. The active participation is going to make up 80% of your grade. Hence also the focus on an active participation in the actual lectures. I want to use the concept of the inverted classroom, which is why I'm making a lot of material, including these videos and the slides, online in advance. The idea is that the extra lectures, the classroom, be it real or virtual, that's going to be a space where you should be able to ask anything, anytime. There are no stupid questions, so feel free to ask, feel free to interrupt. You've got plenty of time to cover all issues. We have a lot of space, and of course, thanks to new technologies, also a lot of tools to communicate and to make this a really interactive class, even though the current pandemic situation makes it difficult in many respects. I'm going to give a total of 4 lectures, as already mentioned. This one on the 8th of September, and this 3 lectures as part of the Human Rights and Human Security in the Arctic part on the 17th, 18th, and 19th of November of this year. There's 3 lectures in November. They're also going to be the introduction to the entire Human Rights and Human Security module, which forms part of the Arctic Studies program. 3 of my colleagues are going to talk about other aspects within the module, or the topics within the module, for example, cultural heritage, cybersecurity, or food. The slides that I've already put online, they're based on a number of textbooks, and there are 2 textbooks which I really want to recommend to you. It's Arctic Governance in a Changing World by Durfee and Johnstone, and The Arctic, What Everyone Needs to Know by Dodds and Nuttall. Both books were published last year in 2019, and I think they give newcomers to the Arctic a really good idea of some of the issues which are relevant for the Arctic and for the people who live in the Arctic, of course. The idea behind this lecture for today is, for 8th of September, is that you get a basic understanding of issues which are important for the people who live in the Arctic, for example in the context of human rights and human security, already with a view to the lectures in November. That you're also, at least those of you who are interested in law, that you get a bit of an idea with regard to the legal research activities related to Arctic law, international Arctic law, and of course then you will be able to talk about these issues, Arctic law, Arctic in general, and so on, and discuss them to a certain level in English. I realize that we are doing this in a language which for most participants, including for myself, is not a first language. So feel free to take time, send me an email, ask questions through Moodle. There are no stupid questions. Feel free to reach out and ask questions whenever you have them. But I want to start with a question myself. What is the Arctic? How do we define the Arctic? There are different ways to do this. When you look at a map, you see the Arctic Circle. For those of you who are taking this course from Rovaniemi, the course is organized, you will be staying probably just a few kilometers away from the Arctic Circle, which just passes just north of the city. Other definitions of the Arctic may include, for example, the temperature. If the average annual temperature is below 10 degrees, for example, it may include vegetation. If there are no more trees, if you're above the tree line, is this in the Arctic? It might include looking at permafrost. If we would use that definition, only a few spots in Finland would actually be part of the Arctic. Often for the people in the Arctic, this distinction between Arctic and subarctic might not be that simple or easy. If you look at places like Greenland, for example, southern Greenland is south of the Arctic Circle. Yet the climatic conditions are different from ones we have in Finnish Lapland, for example. Coastal areas have a different economic system, different climate, and so on, and different experiences from, let's say, more mountainous areas. The area north of the Arctic Circle alone is home to 4 million people. The Arctic is not an empty space. And what I want to talk about today is mainly concerned with the role of the people who live in the Arctic. In fact, if we expand our definition of the Arctic a bit, let's say just going out to around 60 degrees north, which is just a bit north of Helsinki and Stockholm and Oslo, for example, and Petersburg. That area is home to 13 million people. Many of them, of course, in the Russian Federation, So that part area includes a huge part of Russia, large parts of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, of course, and Sweden, Norway, and Finland, as well as, in that case, Iceland. Most of Iceland, of course, being just south of the Arctic Circle, and north of 6 degrees. How then do we perceive the Arctic? For a long time, especially in art and literature and movies, the Arctic was seen as something fairly exotic, remote, cold, and hardly inhabited. But it is not an empty space. It's not like Antarctica. The Arctic has been home for people for thousands of years, basically since the end of the last ice age. Nevertheless, the perceptions of others, of the perceptions others have of the Arctic, they do matter for the Arctic, because a lot of the decisions for the Arctic are made outside of the Arctic. Often there's this idea that there are no people living here, which is far from true. Some time ago in Sweden, a mining company was planning to engage in mining in an area which is of crucial importance to some reindeers, for example. And a lot of protests there were triggered when the head of the company, when asked what the concerns of the local people, was asked what local people. Well, the Arctic is a home to millions of people, and especially indigenous communities. We find indigenous peoples almost all over the Arctic, with the exception of Iceland. And very often they share stories, they share a history. We have a strong colonial history in the Arctic, including here. And the consequences of this colonial history, they can still be felt today. Often the Arctic is seen as a place from which to take something, from which to take natural resources, for example. It might be seen as a place to use as a tourist destination. It might be seen as a symbol for climate change, for example. But for the people who live here, it's simply home. The Arctic has gotten a lot more attention in recent years. Climate change is one of the key reasons for that. Yet, what I want you to learn in this course, on this lecture, in the human rights part of the Arctic Studies program, is that the people of the Arctic matter. This is not just about polar bears or reindeer. It's about the people who live here. The Arctic and the people who live here, they share many challenges. Some of these challenges are felt elsewhere as well. Others might be felt elsewhere, but not to the same degree. Other challenges are unique to the Arctic. Climate change is, of course, the key issue for the Arctic today. Climate change is a very real problem, also here in Finnish Lapland, on the Finnish side of Sapmi. It's a problem that impacts the people who live here in many different ways. The Arctic is warming at about, it's at about roughly twice the rate as the rest of the planet. For the people who live here, that's dramatic. For the animals who live here, for the plants, that's a huge difference. Let me give you one example how climate change can completely change everything you know. In the winter time, the river here in Rovaniemi freeze over. And just a few years ago, I moved here 7 years ago. A few years ago, I wouldn't have thought anything of walking over the frozen river in the winter time, because it was a normal thing to do. In the last few winters, that was not possible. What was something very normal to do, to basically get from one side of the town to the other in the wintertime, is now a deadly danger. The ice simply is not as thick as it used to be. Not long ago, there were places where you could drive a car over the river because the ice was the river was frozen so solid. Not anymore. Melting ice, or the lack of ice, is of course just tip of the iceberg, so to say. If we have more rainfall, that rainfall then might happen more in the form of snow. And the European High North is actually a relatively dry place, apart from the coastal regions, of course. More snow means a lot of challenges. Changing temperatures can actually lead to more snow and ice, or snow and ice in places where we didn't have it before. As it warms, reindeer, for example, pay a heavy price for climate change. Reindeer find their food under the snow, and they would, in the wintertime, they'll dig through the snow in order to be able to eat. What is happening in many places, and a few years ago in Sweden, for example, the government offered subsidies to reindeer herders to compensate for the industrial costs. And in Russia, just across the border, a lot of reindeer died because of this. What happens now increasingly is that during the daytime, the top part of the snow layer starts to melt. And at night it refreezes. What you then have all of a sudden is no longer just snow, through which a reindeer could dig through, but snow with a layer of ice on top. A layer of ice which is so hard that the reindeer cannot dig through anymore, and that reindeer actually starve to death even though there would be enough food for them under the snow, but just now covered with ice which is so frozen that you can't access the food anymore. As the vegetation changes, we have more trees which lose their leaves in the winter, meaning that they keep less snow, and more snow lands on the ground, making it also more difficult for the reindeer to access their food. As it gets warmer, the water temperature in the river goes up, which dramatically affects, for example, salmon. A number of rivers here in the region are among the most important and most pristine salmon rivers in all of Europe. Yet the local communities there are already affected by climate change and by the lack of salmon. Species which are iconic for the Arctic, like reindeer or polar bears, they are often iconic because they also matter for the people. But it's not just about the animals, it's about the relationship of people and nature. This relationship is fundamentally altered already today due to climate change, environmental pollution, land use conflicts, increasing pressure on the land, on the nature here. Another factor which is important for the Arctic is globalization. The Arctic is not a place apart from the rest of the world. It's closely connected to the world. Arctic communities are connected to each other, also across borders. Despite the great distances in the Arctic, there has always been a significant amount of movement. A semi-nomadic lifestyle among the indigenous communities, the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, has long been the norm, and you see this to a certain degree still today, for example in Sweden and Norway with the seasonal reindeer migration, in Russia when reindeer herds move from one pasture area to another between summer and winter. Globalization provides a lot of opportunities. Chances are you're attending this course because of factors which make globalization happen. The internet, for example. The availability of information, the possibility to travel, even though now temporarily restricted due to COVID-19. Anyways, it is becoming more difficult to travel, of course, nowadays. But nevertheless, in principle, our world is more and more connected. This has also implications from people in the Arctic. Not all of the benefits from globalization are actually realized by the people in the Arctic. They don't all end up with the people who live here. Extractive industries, for example, often mean that things are taken out from the land, for example through mining, while there's no corresponding benefit for the people who live here. If land is used for mining, it's lost forever. It can't be used for reindeer herding anymore, for example. Mining has a lot of side effects in terms of polluting the natural environment. Other forms of globalization, for example, tourism. Tourism is an important source of income for a lot of communities here in the north. And it's often seen as a backup, as a plan B, that you don't only have to rely on mining or traditional forms of income. Cross-border business activities have been the norm in the Arctic for a long time. But this also means that the Arctic is vulnerable, that Arctic communities are vulnerable. For example, the European Union and Canada have a free trade agreement, which is still not fully enforced, but only so far as is a competence of the European Union, because of the lack of support from the EU member states. The sanctions the EU and US have against Russia, for example, they are very much felt also here in Finland. Another aspect and a shared challenge in the Arctic is colonialism. The long-term effects of colonialism still felt in the Arctic and for many Arctic communities. The situation has improved in many communities, but it has improved from a very bad standard. 2 generations ago, people were still forced into boarding schools, for example, both in Northern Europe and, for example, in Canada. Indigenous people were forced into boarding schools in order to basically force them to become good citizens, to integrate into the dominant society. Today, society has changed its attitude in this regard. And international law also now places much bigger respect on the right of people to self-determination, to self-determination, and on cultural rights of indigenous communities. Nevertheless, structural effects of colonialism and structural inequalities continue to exist. There's still discrimination against indigenous people in the Arctic. There's more poverty, there's less food security, for example. And that's why the Arctic is sometimes referred to as the third world in the first world. A part of very rich countries, like the US, Canada, or Northern European countries, or to a certain degree also Russia, a part of very rich countries which is suffering discrimination which has economic effects. The economy here in the region is very often very much dependent on extractive industries. We see this in Greenland the same way, or not necessarily in the same way, but just like we see it in Norway or Sweden or here. You may have heard in the news the plans to start oil drilling again in Alaska. or Norway, or of course in the Russian Federation. Now, all of this requires infrastructure. More mines require more roads or railways to transport goods. More infrastructure takes away more space. If you build a railway, you take that space away from reindeer herding, for example. Infrastructure, on the other hand, means connectivity. A good road connects different communities. Now, infrastructure requires investments. To keep a road, for example, in a good condition, especially after a harsh winter, you have to make investments. Because of the costs associated with maintaining infrastructure, there have been discussions, for example, in Finland, whether it would make more sense to build back some existing roads, smaller roads in the far north, and replace them with gravel roads, which of course are not damaged like that, like a paved road it would be by the frosts and the melting water in the spring. In other places where roads and entire towns are built on permafrost, the melting of the permafrost means that you have enormous systematic damage to the infrastructure, to buildings, to roads, and so on. Last year I had the pleasure to visit the city of Yakutsk in Russia, one of the coldest places on the planet. And when talking with young people, they're one of what they would need in terms of sustainable development, because that was the topic of a lot of discussions there. One of the first things that always came up was road infrastructure, better roads. Something that we take for granted elsewhere is really a life and death matter in other locations. Small communities in the Arctic which are no longer accessible because the permafrost has been melting and the few roads that exist basically turned into mud. These communities feel very much cut off. In a number of places, for example in the Canadian Arctic, there are no more overland connections, even though they did exist in the past. And now these communities are be dependent on transport by waterways, through rivers, for example, or through the sea, or transport by helicopter. Now you can imagine that even a long car ride is significantly cheaper than a helicopter flight. That means that prices go up, prices for consumables go up, like food, for example, and that in turn means that food security is threatened in remote Arctic communities, also as a consequence of climate change, which negatively affects infrastructure. Very often you'll see that relationships in the Arctic are center-periphery relationships. The Arctic is sparsely populated, and often there's this perception that we would depend on centers like Helsinki or Stockholm or Moscow, or to Siberia, in order to access services, get funding for services, and so on. A lot of the decisions for the Arctic are made in capital cities which are far away from the reality of the Arctic, be that Ottawa or Washington DC. Within the Arctic, of course, we have smaller centers like Rovaniemi or Tromsø or Murmansk, which serve as regional centers. This is something that becomes particularly visible when we look at issues, for example, such as healthcare, access to healthcare. Here in Rovaniemi we have the Lapland Central Hospital, but if you think of the more remote locations, you will see that suddenly you might have to drive for several hours in order to access a hospital. Now, municipalities have, of course, local health centers, but they're limited, of course, due to their size, equipment, and so on. For a lot of people, for example, let's say Finnish Lapland, requiring regular medical treatment basically will mean moving away from your home municipality into Rovaniemi or, for example, Norway to Tromsø in order to get the medical services that you need. This is not easily comparable with the situation of somebody who lives in the countryside somewhere else in Europe. So this is not the same as living in a village, let's say in the Netherlands or in Belgium or France or Italy. Rather, the distances are not just distances which can be measured in kilometers, but distances which can be measured in the lack of service or the difficulty in accessing a service. At the same time, these shared challenges have led to a shared understanding of the Arctic. People of the Arctic now communicate much more with each other and they cooperate much more with each other. We see this in Europe, between Norway, Sweden and Finland, where the borders have always been relatively open for a long time. This is not yet the case everywhere. For example, the connection between Nuuk in Greenland and Iqaluit in Nunavut in Canada, that is not as dense in terms of transport or cultural interaction, for example, as one might expect. In Europe, we certainly have the benefit of relatively easy connectivity. If you get on a plane Rovaniemi within an hour and say 15 minutes, you can be in Helsinki. Now a bit longer because Finland is using smaller planes which fly a bit slower due to the lower passenger numbers, but in principle, getting from here to the center of Finland to Helsinki is a matter of hours. Even if you take the train within a day, you're there. The flip side is that, yes, we are relatively well connected, but we also depend on these connections. Simply because a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the decision-making infrastructure simply is not here, but for example in Helsinki or in Stockholm, Oslo and so on. So this is a double-edged sword. The connectivity is there because it has to be there. Now, when we talk about the Arctic, just mentioned a number of cities: Rovaniemi, Tromsø, Murmansk. These are really larger towns. Rovaniemi, something like 63,000 people. Tromsø, just a bit bigger, with around 70,000 inhabitants. They are regional centers. The biggest of these regional centers in the Arctic is, of course, Murmansk. Anchorage, roughly the same size in terms of population, if I recall correctly. So here we're talking about real cities. But this urbanization is also something which has effects on other locations in the Arctic. We centralize services. In Finnish Lapland, for example, we have the University of Lapland, here with the University of Applied Sciences, and a separate campus, and so on. But most of this is concentrated in the Rovaniemi, Kemi, Tornio area. There's summer school Assoc in Inari, but in terms of higher education, we're pretty much concentrated in the south of Finnish Lapland. Nowadays we can do a lot online, but in practical terms you'll either have to travel very long distances frequently, or you'll actually have to move here. If you live in the far north of Finland, that means having to move somewhere over 400 kilometers just to get here. That is a decision which is often not easy, but often it's also no choice for the younger generation. A lot of young people don't really see a future in the villages, and as somebody who grew up in a village himself, I fully understand that sentiment. Digitalization is an important aspect of making sure that villages in the far north maintain a certain quality of life, and that's still relevant there. In the sense that you can still have a good job while staying in your village. Today, for example, a lot of, or most of the, or at least a large number, not sure if it's most, but a large number of indigenous people in the Arctic, they live no longer in their traditional home areas, but in bigger cities. We need these connections, but urbanization, while it opens a door together with globalization and connectivity, it opens a door to the wider world, it too can be a double-edged sword, because once people start to leave the smaller communities, it's going to be hard to get services back in the future. And at least in Finland, we are blessed by a relatively fair distribution of services, public services, but also private enterprise, based on the notion of equality, with the idea that the same service should be available all over the country, independent of where you happen to live. You will see this, for example, with regard to the mobile phone reception across Finland, which is excellent when you compare it to a lot of other European countries, for example. The Arctic is a space of cooperation. The indigenous Sami people, for example, they have been, their land is now governed by 4 different nation states: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Yet their homeland is one land, they're one people. And in a similar way, it's idea of living beyond borders, which is crucial to a lot of communities in the Arctic. If you look at the border of Sweden and Finland, for example, you see on the Swedish side, a region is often referred to as Myanmar, where people speak a language which is very similar to Finnish, Meänkieli. And the Tornio River, there, for example, which now forms a border between Sweden and Finland, was not seen as something which divides, but rather something which connects people. Often the nation states are perceived as something relatively artificial here. And one reason for that is that people have been living here for thousands of years. The land where I'm recording this is ancient Sami land. It's currently not recognized as a Sami home area within the Finnish constitution, within Finnish law. But initially this was the homeland of the Sami people. Today Finnish law recognizes parts of the northernmost parts of Finnish Lapland as part of the Sami home area, with specific norms pertaining to that legal status. But we'll get to that later in the course. What is notable about the Arctic is the cooperation across borders, also between countries, and also if the political situation otherwise would not necessarily indicate that cooperation is something that would be sought after. Think, for example, about the NATO countries and the Russian Federation. Yet cooperation is crucial, not just because of the shared challenges, and potentially also shared solutions, cooperation is crucial because of the people who live in the Arctic. We are not many, we are from very different backgrounds. Some have families who have lived here for thousands of years, some came here last week, literally. Yet, we share an environment which brings particular challenges with it. A lot of these challenges cannot be dealt with by a single nation state, but they have to be dealt with across borders. Cooperation in the Arctic often aims at finding solutions for shared problems. This cooperation is not new. We have, for example, the Spitsbergen Treaty of 1920, where we have a special legal status for Svalbard, the archipelago which is part of Norway, but where citizens of states which have ratified the Svalbard Treaty have specific rights, for example, economic rights. Non-Arctic factors, for example, the EU sanctions against Russia, they do play a role in this, of course, but that role is limited. There are things that, let's say, companies from Finland cannot do right now with regard to the Russian Federation, with regard to potential customers in the Russian Federation. But there's nevertheless a spirit of cooperation between governments as well. Even if this cooperation might be limited to things like enhancing security, disaster prevention, disaster relief, scientific cooperation. The area, the land in the Arctic, is fully under the sovereignty of the Arctic countries. This full sovereignty is a key feature which distinguishes the situation in the Arctic from the situation in Antarctica. In Antarctica, we have no sovereign states. Here we only have sovereign states. In fact, it's only the central part of the Arctic Ocean, which is beyond the sovereignty of nation states. The Central Arctic Ocean, as the other parts of the Arctic Ocean, they're regulated already. They're regulated through international law. The International Law of the Sea, for example, regulates very clearly which rights a country has in its territorial sea, that's up to 12 nautical miles from the coast, in its exclusive economic zone, up to 200 nautical miles, on the continental shelf, and of course also in the high seas. International law is a crucial tool for cooperation in the Arctic. The most important forum for cooperation in the Arctic through international law is the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council consists of the 8 Arctic states, the US, Canada, Iceland, Denmark with regard to Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Russian Federation. The Arctic Council is not a classical international organization. Rather, it has different types of participants, the states as members, but also indigenous representatives as so-called permanent participants on almost equal footing with the states. The increasing interest of outsiders in the Arctic means that non-Arctic states have now also expressed a significant interest in what's happening in the Arctic Council, and there are a number of so-called observers. For example, the People's Republic of China is one of the observers in the Arctic Council, as are other countries, for example, Germany or Italy. Usually there's a need to show specific interest in the Arctic, which can be proven, for example, by highlighting the past scientific activities in the region. Both the International Law of the Sea and other international legal frameworks in a wider sense, and the Arctic Council, they're forms of governance. Governance is not just about imposing rules. Governance, as Durfee and Johnson called it, is a process. This process involves a wide range of actors. I earlier mentioned, for example, the Sami Council, the Sami parliaments. Some people in the different Nordic countries elect Sami parliaments for their respective states, with the exception of Russia. So there's a Sami parliament for Norway, one for Sweden, one for Finland, not to be confused with the Sami Council. And the national Sami parliaments, they have a role in decision making on the national level. For example, the Finnish Sami parliament is heard with regard to planned mining projects in the Sami home area. Governance happens on very different levels. And the importance of governance institutions can also vary from situation to situation, but also between the different needs of people. Governance levels include the municipalities, villages, municipalities, regions like Lapland, Finnish Lapland. It includes nation states, supranational entity, in that case the European Union, of which Sweden and Finland are members, or of course international fora like the Arctic Council. There is often a discussion whether there might be potential for conflict in the Arctic. And the Arctic has never been, or has not been, a fully peaceful place. The Arctic was part of the conflict in World War II. It was part of the conflict geography of the Cold War. And there's of course a significant military and security interest in the Arctic. Nevertheless, the current situation does not necessarily mean that there's a heightened risk of conflict in the Arctic. The future of the Arctic certainly remains one of cooperation. None of the Arctic powers has a real interest in a conflict in the Arctic. All have an interest, of course, in protecting their rights and making sure that they don't lose anything when compared to other countries. But I see the risk of a conflict as relatively low. What is entirely possible, of course, is if a conflict would break out elsewhere, that it would spill over into the Arctic. Sometimes discussions about the Arctic are used as a proxy to basically cover other problems. For example, there's been some criticism by the Russian Federation with regard to Norway's management of Svalbard, concerns which are not fully justified in my opinion, because the Norwegian authorities are doing a fairly good job there. For example, when it comes to the search and rescue services, which is one issue that has been raised by the Russian Federation. That debate is more of a cover for the whole conflict between Russia and the West, not necessarily a problem really pertaining to Svalbard. That's something that we sometimes have to keep in mind when we talk about the theoretical possibility for conflict in the Arctic. That the sources for any such conflict are likely not to come from the Arctic, but from outside the region. Another reason why conflict is unlikely in the Arctic is that in an ideal scenario, at least, the local communities have a clear say in their governance. That's not the case everywhere. And often it's also indigenous communities which might feel left out because of the way decisions are structured and made. Remember I said earlier that a lot of decisions are made outside the Arctic, often with little information about the actual reality in the Arctic. Nevertheless, a lot of these conflicts which we face in the Arctic are fairly, these challenges which we face in the Arctic, they're fairly complex. And complex problems they require solutions, for example, through negotiation. International law provides a framework for this. And there are practically no territorial conflicts in the Arctic. There are certainly different questions with regard to the legal status, let's say, of Canada's waters, to try to phrase it somewhat neutrally, the water between the Canadian islands and the Canadian mainland, which Canada claims as internal waters, a view which is contested, for example, by the US. Another reason why conflict in the Arctic is becoming less and less likely is that it's no longer the Arctic states which are involved in the Arctic. The people who live in the Arctic have a voice, they get heard more and more. The Arctic is becoming more interesting also for outside actors, like the European countries or China, for example. There's a saying in Arctic circles, which you probably hear at every conference about the Arctic, that I have no idea who came with that first. That what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And to a certain extent, that's actually true. Originally, I think this might have referred to climate change, that the climate change effects we first see in the Arctic mean that we'll also see climate change elsewhere. But the Arctic is now connected to the rest of the world. People have a stake in the Arctic, they have an interest in the Arctic. And that is also something that all Arctic actors are aware of. Even issues which under other conditions could be politically problematic are dealt with relatively peacefully in the Arctic. For example, Greenland is potentially moving towards independence. Greenland and Nunavut are the two parts of the Arctic which have the most autonomy from their respective home countries. Denmark with regard to Greenland, and Nunavut, of course, with regard to Canada. It remains to be seen how this develops, but the fact that Arctic regions have a significant degree of autonomy and that they are able to really decide the matters which are relevant for them on a local and regional level, that's already an important step forward. The Arctic is not empty, it's home to many people, and the Arctic as a land also matters. It matters to the people who live here, especially to the indigenous peoples all over the Arctic, because of the strong relationship between people and land, and of course the water. When we talk about indigenous rights, when we say land, we always, of course, mean the rivers, lakes, sea, and so on. Today we see land use conflicts. We see traditional ways of making a living challenged by modern ways. We see railroads pitted against reindeer. Yet in the Arctic we have space where everything is possible at the same time, simultaneously. Having a modern job requiring a fast internet connection and so on, and engaging in traditional livelihoods at the same time. That's not a contradiction, but it's a practical reality for a lot of people in the Arctic. The Arctic is characterized by cooperation. Cooperation between communities and cooperation between states. When it comes to the cooperation between states, international law is a key tool, if not the key tool, to facilitate this cooperation. The compliance rate with international law in the Arctic is relatively high. And that does matter. Yes, we have certainly governments in the Arctic which are known for not necessarily always being compliant with international legal standards. Yet when it comes to matters in the Arctic, the respect for international Arctic law is relatively high. It's easy to underestimate the importance of public international law, especially when we look at the large number of violations of international law we see in many other parts of the world. I'm not saying that the respect for international law is perfect here, far from it, but there's a general level of respect, and certainly willingness among a lot of governments, regardless of political affiliation, to improve respect for international law. For example, when it comes to the rights of indigenous peoples. Around a tenth of the population of the Arctic is actually indigenous. But these experiences, this knowledge, which is crucial for living in the Arctic. Already mentioned the shared colonial experience and the role of indigenous communities or representatives of indigenous communities in the Arctic Council. The living reality of indigenous peoples in the Arctic is reflected in the governance of the Arctic. Imperfectly, of course, but it is reflected to a certain degree. Nevertheless, indigenous rights are at times under threat. That can involve, for example, land use rights, when mining projects encroach on reindeer herding grounds, but also can refer to other cultural rights. Reindeer herding is an important aspect of the indigenous culture in the Arctic, but of course the culture is more than just reindeer herding. You will see, for example, in souvenir shops items which look like traditional handicrafts of the Sami people here, but often these items are not made here but in a factory halfway around the world, for example in China or wherever. The intellectual property of this traditional work, however, rests of course with the indigenous people here. Be it a copied gakti or some dress or a kuksa cup, things like that. They are being used frequently for commercial purposes. Cultural rights are often insufficiently protected. On the other hand, are there important steps forward? For example, that there can be school, at least kindergarten education in the Sami languages, also in the bigger cities like Helsinki, where a lot of Sami people have moved from here. We have Sami place names in use, at least in the northernmost parts of Finland. And that's important because it reminds us of the origin story of these places. It reminds us of the people who are connected to these places. Of the people who have called this home for so many generations already. These indigenous cultures, be it in the Arctic or elsewhere, they are not set in stone, they are not a relic from the past. Rather, these are modern living cultures which are active today. Cultures which develop further. You can see this when you're looking at music or design and so on. This is not just a question of modern technology, but these cultures are cultures in their own right, just like French culture, Italian culture, whatever. They are not there to be simply consumed. Indigenous communities, indigenous peoples no longer are passive, but since the 1970s they've played an increasingly active role also in shaping their rights and ensuring the protection of their rights under international law. International law is a key tool towards the protection of human rights in the Arctic, including indigenous rights and community rights. In the early stages of international indigenous rights law, this was not the case. The International Labour Organization, for example, adopted its Convention number 107 in 1957. At that time, indigenous rights law was seen as a collection of rights which did not serve indigenous peoples or indigenous individuals so much as to facilitate the inclusion, the assimilation of indigenous communities into the dominant community. There was no indigenous input there. 1957, that was of course before the great wave of decolonization in the 1960s. Today, ILO Convention 107 does not apply anymore for most countries, rather for most countries with indigenous communities which have bothered to ratify international treaties. ILO Convention number 169, which dates back to 1989, is a key document. In addition, Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966 protects the rights of minorities, including indigenous peoples, together with the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the same year. And these two covenants, together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, form the so-called International Bill of Human Rights. The 1989 International Labour Organization Convention number 169 only reflects this trend towards a human rights approach in indigenous rights. It creates collective rights for indigenous peoples, for example. Like all the other conventions drafted by the International Labour Organization, it does not provide easy access for potential litigation. Rather, it relies on the general system of litigation which is based on the constitution of the ILO. This treaty, which is now already more than 30 years old, has been superseded in part already by customary international law, and it has not been ratified by a lot of countries. Denmark, with regard to Greenland, and Norway have ratified it. Canada, the US, Sweden, Finland and Russia all have not. So its practical value is limited from purely legal perspective, but its political impact has been enormous. Here in Finland we've been discussing the convention basically for 3 decades now. And the question has always been, what do we need to do as a society to make sure that we can actually ratify this? That is something that's really important, especially for the lawyers among you, to understand that in Finland the basic attitude towards international treaties is that we'll only ratify when we are sure that we comply with them, that the national law is already in compliance with the treaty obligation. And that is a very honorable approach, because it will guarantee, if taken seriously, it guarantees compliance with international law from day one. So it's not that you ratify an international treaty and then afterwards see how you show compliance, but rather the Finnish approach is to make sure that national law is in line with the international treaty in question, so that can ratify it and be fully in compliance on the first day that it applies. Today, ILO Convention 169, however, has been superseded to a certain degree by customary international law. Customary international law requires state practice, certain behavior of states, and opinio juris. Opinio juris means a conviction of the state that has to behave in a specific way. State practice can consist of government decisions, for example, how to implement international law on the local level, support for non-binding declarations, for example, within the UN General Assembly. How does the state vote there? Things like that. In that context, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is particularly noteworthy. It was adopted in 2007 and is upon the combination of decades of work, also of indigenous representatives at the United Nations. It includes in a non-binding form the current law on the rights of indigenous peoples under international law. It was created through a mechanism which was set up by the UN, but was made with the input of the indigenous peoples. A number of states rely on that declaration, UNTRIP, as it's abbreviated, to shape their own national law in the knowledge that this reflects the existing customary international law. This includes the right to self-determination, which is also found already in Article 1 of the two covenants of 1966, which I mentioned earlier. The self-determination of peoples, including indigenous peoples, includes the right to decide about natural resources on your land. Indigenous peoples therefore have a say over what happens to their land and their resources. Today, international law does not give indigenous peoples a veto power, but has created the standard of so-called free, prior, and informed consent. Consent here is something that the state has to seek. So the duty of the state is to aim at getting the indigenous people's free, prior, and informed consent. The term consent here therefore does not mean a veto power, but rather a duty of the state to consult with indigenous peoples with the aim of getting their consent. Earlier I mentioned the example of the Sami parliament in Finland and the mining legislation. At the end of the day, it's up to indigenous communities to decide what they do with their land, with their natural resources. We often might have this perception of indigenous communities being fully oriented towards protecting nature. This does not necessarily have to be the case. So I have to warn you against an overly romantic view on these issues. Rather, like any other people, indigenous peoples have the right to decide what happens to their resources. So it might very well be that in specific circumstances, an indigenous people might find economic activity, for example mining, to be the most beneficial, to be the course of action which is most beneficial to the people in the long run. For example, in Canada there's a large mine called Diavik, where a certain percentage of the workers are indigenous, a certain percentage of the workers are from the region or from northern Canada and so on. So there the idea was that the local community gets something in the form of more jobs, of job trainings and so on. Of course, a mine is not forever. At some point it will be empty, while if we, right, the land will feed reindeer forever. So that is an economic decision, macroeconomic decision, a political decision, but it's a decision which is to be made by indigenous peoples and not by anybody from the outside. And that's at the core of the right to self-determination, where we look at it from an economic perspective. Indigenous peoples don't yet have the full sovereignty again, but in recent decades, especially since the 70s, they're moving towards a greater recognition of their rights through international law. And as I mentioned, the cases of Greenland and Nunavut also more recognition of an autonomous status within domestic law. Public international law is an important tool to shape the debate in the Arctic, to shape governance in the Arctic. On the local level, international law matters because this is where we implement international law at the end of the day. International law is not just restricted to a courtroom in The Hague. Rather, it does matter on the local level. It has practical impacts. And as I mentioned already, the compliance rate in the Arctic is fairly high. International law gives us different legal regimes which are relevant for the Arctic. For example, the international law of the sea, international human rights law, international environmental law. It is important to make a clear distinction between international law and international politics, but they are related to each other. Law is the end product, often, of politics. But it's important to be able to look beyond the borders of your own discipline. I assume that this course will be attended by students from multiple disciplines. And for example, international relations theory is something that also has lawyers to teach something about the Arctic. The natural sciences are an important source of information when it comes to policy decisions. Making law, making regulations for the Arctic is not a purely legal process. It's a societal process in an ideal case, which is informed by science. For the Arctic, or for understanding the Arctic today, it's essential to have a basic understanding of international law. Not just with regard to the political, legal aspects, but also with regard to the big questions. Climate change, the protection of the environment, globalization, indigenous rights. According to Durfee and Johnstone, in the textbook I recommended you at the beginning of the session, the Arctic, to quote, the Arctic has weak institutions and strong cooperation, unquote. And that's true. The institutional side, with the Arctic Council, for example, or the Arctic 5, or the Arctic 5+5 with regard to the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement, these are relatively weak institutions if we compare them to classical international organizations like the International Maritime Organization, let alone to something like the European Union. But the sense of cooperation is strong, and the practical impact of cross-border cooperation can really be felt in the Arctic. International cooperation complements state sovereignty. Unlike in Antarctica, states are the corners and the core of governance in the Arctic. Yet, states have to cooperate in the Arctic. The resources are limited. The ability to engage in the Arctic is limited. There might be an exception to be made here for the Russian Federation, which basically covers half of the Arctic, and which long has had a specific Arctic outlook. To some degree also Canada, but there we already reached some limitations with regard to the population and the strong focus on the south of the country. But especially in Northern Europe, we have to cooperate. It's impossible to go everything alone. And there are many shared concerns which open the door for cooperation. When we talk about the Arctic as a whole, I also want to say a few words at least about the history of the Arctic. Often we see the Arctic as a remote place, and you've already learned it's an empty place, of course. But what do we know about the history, really? 1,000 years ago, this here was all Sami territory. And the colonial phase just happened a bit over 1,000 years ago in southern Finduscandia, and in the second millennium further to the north. Still today you find a lot of Sami place names hundreds of kilometers from here. For example, there's a national park called Nuuksio in Espoo, which is right next to Helsinki, which is about 800 kilometers south of here. Archaeological research has revealed artifacts, for example, close to Lake Ladoga, Lake Nega, in what's today the Russian Federation. And cultural links have been made by archaeologists between these finds and the Sami culture. That's something that we do have to keep in mind. That we're not talking about a space which was completely empty at some point. The exception, of course, being Iceland, which did not have an indigenous population in that sense. But it's this history which we have to keep in mind, that this land has a strong colonial history, a colonial experience. For Finland, this is true in many ways. For the Finnish part of Sami, even more so. So it's not just the Nordic colonization of the Sami lands, but Finland was long part of Sweden, and until just over 100 years ago, part of the Russian Federation. So it just has been independent as a country for a bit more than a century. It suffered significantly, for example, during World War II. For example, Rovaniemi was largely destroyed by retreating German forces, which made their way north to Norway, after Finland had changed sides. So there is a significant amount of history here in Finland, and Finnish Lapland in particular, which is often not known outside the region, outside the country. So I strongly encourage you to also look at that and to learn a bit about the land that you're spending your studies on, for those of you who are, especially for those of you who are physically present in Rovaniemi, of course. And you'll also see the effects of climate change. No part of the world is as affected by climate change as the Arctic. This is not just about changing weather patterns or being a bit warmer on average. It changes the vegetation, it changes the presence of animals, it changes the CO2 level in the atmosphere. It means that for a lot of people in the Arctic, the ground under their feet is literally disappearing when the permafrost is melting. Melting permafrost only accelerates climate change because it releases methane, which is stored in the ground. Methane itself accelerates then the warming process on the long term. But there are also factors which accelerate this process fairly quickly, like carbon, so soot. That's a short-term climate forcer. And that's something, if we could tackle this successfully, that would already have a significant impact on improving the situation in the Arctic. The effect of climate change is of course seen most prominently when we look at sea ice. Usually around September, so probably around the time when you're going to see this, we'll have a few days later than that, probably usually have the annual sea ice minimum in the northern hemisphere in the Arctic. The effects have been devastating in recent years, and 2020 is on track to be one of the worst years. The loss of sea ice is not just a problem for 1 year or one winter or something, but it means that there's much less old ice, thick ice, multi-year ice. And it's now estimated that maybe already in the 2030s we could see the Arctic Ocean practically ice-free, meaning less than 1 million square kilometers of sea ice in the summer months. It's now thought that the last ice, once the Arctic ice melts, last ice will be along the northern coast of Greenland and Canada. But even that is now somewhat in doubt. There's currently a scientific research project underway, Project Mosaic, along the research vessel Polarstein. And just recently they went through exactly that area, the part of the Arctic north of Canada and Greenland, expecting a significant amount of ice, and there was much fewer than anticipated. Much less ice than anticipated. Climate change has a dramatic impact, and that's the impact we already see today over the course of a few years already, and it will significantly impact the way people live in the Arctic, but also the way the Arctic ecosystem functions. The loss of sea ice will accelerate climate change. As the glaciers melt in Greenland, as the ice cap in the Arctic Ocean disappears, we're going to lose albedo for the whole planet. So Earth's albedo is going to be reduced, meaning that the planet retains more energy. The seawater is already getting warmer. A lot of the climate change effects are hardly visible for us today, but they happen at sea in terms of getting the seawater hotter than before. This can affect maybe even the Gulf Stream. It can lead to an increasing likelihood of storms and of severe storms. A few hours before I've been recording this, the Hurricane Laura, for example, has hit parts of the US coast and the Gulf of Mexico. These extreme storms are likely to become more frequent. That is something that we also see in the Arctic. You will notice that there are relatively few thunderstorms in the Arctic, especially if you come from, let's say, Central European countries, like Germany, France, and so on. This is something that is changing as well. With more thunderstorms, not so much here in Finnish Lapland, but for example in Alaska, the number has been going up in recent years quite dramatically. Climate change affects the biodiversity of the Arctic. It affects the animals which live here. It also affects plant life, the flora. New plants are migrating north basically as it gets warmer. Plants which wouldn't have survived here in the past. At sea, fish migrate in the search for colder waters. A good example for that is mackerel. Until a few years ago, mackerel was hardly found in the waters around Iceland. It was a bit of bycatch, but somebody who was working in the Icelandic fisheries industry once told me that not that long ago, basically people hardly knew what to do with it. Because they would catch a few every now and then, but that was it. Today, mackerel is an important aspect of the whole Icelandic economy, of the fishing industry there. In the long run, however, that's not going to last, because as it gets warmer, the mackerel will go further north, and eventually the swarms will get out of the northern side of the Icelandic exclusive economic zone. Climate change happens at an incredibly fast pace. I realize that it's often difficult to see, because you might think that we've had hot and dry summers before, but here this is a reality which can feel almost every day, and it has a social impact as well. Think, for example, about the generational relationship, the relationship between different generations. For centuries, for thousands of years even, you could give knowledge to the next generation, knowledge about the natural environment, about the ice, about where is it safe to cross maybe a river, to cross a river maybe early in the winter, things like that. This knowledge is no longer valid. In fact, in some cases, relying on old knowledge under new circumstances can even be dangerous. What does this do to the relationship, let's say, between different generations, if it would have been the normal thing to learn things from your parents or grandparents, things about the natural environment? What if you can no longer trust this traditional knowledge because the situation on the ground has changed so quickly? The knowledge which has been gained over thousands of years becomes fragile in a sense. We have to relearn our own environment here. This comes on top of the colonial history that I mentioned. The Sami people up here, their land is basically torn apart to 4 areas, belonging to 4 different nation states. In the past, they were even forced to pay taxes to 2 or 3 different rulers at the same time. Fortunately, modern tax law protects against that. But it's still a fact that national borders, including the border to the Russian Federation, which is, of course, much more close than the borders, let's say, between Finland and Sweden and Norway, national borders define life in a way which is artificial to the people who've always lived here long before these nation states came into existence. In the slides for this lecture, you're going to find a bit more information about the settlement of the Arctic, about the colonial history, but also about the language and the rights and the economic life of the people who live here. Keep in mind that this way of life of indigenous communities here, it's a modern way of life. For somebody from the outside, it might seem old-fashioned if people engage in activities like fishing or reindeer herding. Yet it is a modern way of life under specific circumstances. And often it is this respect for indigenous cultures, but also the respect for the right to self-determination under international law. That is often missing. Also here in the Arctic, also in debates here in the Arctic. The long-term effects of colonization can still be felt in the Arctic today, also in economic terms, for example, in terms of language rights, in terms of access to services. As the time frame for this lecture comes to an end, I would like to ask you to look in particular at the slides on statehood, on colonization of the Arctic. And I encourage you to learn about the people of the Arctic and their historic experiences as well. Keep in mind that we are not talking about one static Arctic, that the Arctic is more than just polar bears and reindeer. It's more than the nation states. It's a whole tapestry, a web of rich history, of rich cultures, of thousands of years of experiences in an environment which is both very beautiful but also very harsh. In order to survive in the Arctic, cooperation is essential. And it's this sense of cooperation which has been transferred also to the interaction between nation states. Today, this interaction is made possible through international law, and international law is making a great contribution to the development of the Arctic. Sustainable development is one of the key challenges here in the region. How can we make sure that future generations really can have a home here with good jobs, a good income, but also with security? protection against conflict, and with safety, protection against the challenges that come, for example, from climate change, with the increased risk of flooding in spring, but also with a threat to food security, with many open questions with regard to the economic future of these lands. Cooperation very often can be the key to these issues. The Arctic has many definitions, it has many faces, it has a very complex history, but also has the potential for a great future. A future in which the natural environment is not exploited but protected, in which decisions are made by the people who live in the Arctic instead of only outside of the Arctic. A future in which rights matter, in particular the rights of indigenous peoples, but also the rights of everybody who's making the Arctic their home, while respecting the rich heritage of this land and recognizing its colonial history. Arctic governance is based on respect and on cooperation. This is not always without challenges, but especially in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War have shown that cooperation is possible. There's not always complete agreement between the governments of the Arctic countries, but the Arctic shows that cooperation is possible even beyond political divides and even in situations which bring great challenges with them. I hope that you found this a bit interesting as an introduction to the Arctic, to the people who live here, and I'd be glad if to answer any questions you have, so feel free to send me an email or to contact me through Moodle, those who participate in the course. And of course, those of you who want, you're most welcome to attend the course on 17th, 18th and 19th of November this year on human rights and human security in the Arctic. I wish you a lot of fun with your studies, even though they come under difficult circumstances. And those of you who are physically in Rovaniemi, a great stay here. And all of you, stay safe, stay healthy, and all the best.